afternoon. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 5, 4, and 30 seconds.
What? Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? Yes, I sure can. Okay, this is interesting. There go the lights. Oh.
We are here at the Scotts Valley Library. It is the 29th of October, 2019. We are here with Sarah Rabkin and Chuck Atkinson to talk about the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you start by telling me how long you've both been in Santa Cruz?
You want to start since you've been here longer?
I've been here 45 years, just about.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I came in 1983. So, whatever the math is, 36.
Sure. All right. Can you tell us your earthquake story?
Sure.
What you were doing before, during, and after?
Shall I start?
Sure.
Okay. So, I was at the time teaching on the faculty at UC Santa Cruz in the writing program. I was teaching, I had to look this up, but I was teaching 2 sections of the Crown College core course. And I was also employed in exchange for free rent as what they call the resident preceptor in the Crown Merrill apartments. Which meant I had a lovely apartment to live in on my own that was attached to student apartments in that complex. And I was working with student resident assistants, RAs, undergraduates who had some responsibility for their fellow students. And when the earthquake hit, I was in a union meeting. It was a meeting of the local chapter of the University of California, the University Council of the AFT, which was the lecturers union at UCSC. And I remember Mike Rabkin was there in the meeting, and I can't remember whether he was on the city council at the time or whether he was mayor at the time. You know, he was for many years on and off in both of those positions, as well as being a faculty member at UC Santa Cruz. But he was also an organizer of the UCAFT. So he was there, and I remember my colleague Sarah Hope Parmeter was there because she and I were sitting together, sitting in a room at Merrill College, kind of nondescript, possibly windowless room, and all of a sudden something told us the earthquake was happening. I can't remember whether it was the jolt or the rumble that let us know, but before we knew it, Sarah Hope Parmeter and I were underneath a table, a low kind of coffee table in the room, and then we were looking at the plastic covers from ceiling fluorescent lights, sort of like the ones in this room, on the floor next to us, which, had we not dived under that table, might actually have hit us in the head. And I still don't remember seeing or perceiving those light covers fall. So it seems to me that the earthquake made a lot more noise than I realized at the time, that the rumble may even have covered up the sound of the falling light covers. Anyway, one reason I remember Mike Rabkin being there is that he had, I believe it was a transistor radio, which was more standard fare in 1989, and he'd had it turned on because he was listening to the World Series. So after some period of time passed, we all filed out of the meeting room at Merrill into the courtyard outside that meeting room, and he was holding the transistor radio to his ear, listening to reports from the game, and telling all of us that the quake we just experienced must have hit hard in San Francisco too, because of what was happening at the ballpark. So that's my immediate experience or memory of the earthquake. And I was thinking as we were coming here how 30 years is a long time, and memory is a funny thing. I didn't even remember, in fact, what classes I was teaching at the time. So I went back and jumped into the UCSC faculty website and found the narrative evaluations I had written for students that quarter, that fall, 1989. And I couldn't have told you what subject the Crown Core course was teaching then. And it was astonishing to me how little I actually remembered. I read these detailed accounts I wrote of all my students' performance, and I have no active memory of any of that. It was like reading somebody else's narrative evaluation. So I realized how sort of attenuated and distorted my memories probably are, and the memories I can share with you are probably the tip of an iceberg. Who knows what else was happening that I don't retain anymore. But because I was working as a resident preceptor, I was responsible for all these students who were living in the apartments at the time. And so at some point after that meeting was over, I went back to the apartments to see what was happening there. And the main thing I remember is about the RA I was working with directly, whose name was Hung Dao. He was a Vietnamese immigrant, a very lovely young man. We remained friends for quite a few years after that. And he was hyper responsible. And he had when the quake hit, he later told me he'd been showering. And he was completely lathered up when he felt the shaking begin. And he was so responsible, he didn't bother to rinse himself off. He dashed out of the shower, toweled off, and went out to see how all the students were doing. Wow. And I was so grateful for him. And that night, all the students had to file out of their residences. They couldn't return until campus engineers had looked over the place and made sure that it was going to be safe. And of course, there were aftershocks happening. And my memory is that students had to spend that night outside of the dorm of the apartment. I could be wrong, but they were spreading blankets in the parking lot and on the lawns outside the apartments, and they had all this ice cream and other perishable food from their freezers and fridges that they were sort of making a party out of it, is most of what I remember. I'm sure some of them were traumatized and upset, but there was also a kind of party atmosphere there, and I remember Hung just moving among the students, shepherding them and making sure that everybody was okay. I also remember another Crown student who became a good friend of ours, Tiffin Clegg, who was a remarkably accomplished photographer and a budding journalist at the time, also a biology major. He's now a doctor living in Washington State. But at the time, I think he was still a student and he was on campus. He took himself right downtown as soon as the dust cleared and started taking photographs of what had gone on downtown. He captured some remarkable images of the collapsed brick buildings and the craziness that was downtown Santa Cruz. And I can give you his contact information if you'd like to look up those photographs. I bet he still has them. He also had an amazing talent for being in the right place at the right time. He also did a lot of traveling that year, and he sent me a piece of the Berlin Wall because he happened to be in Berlin when the wall was coming down. So he was both a wonderful recorder of events and just knew how to put himself in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
There's so many places that touched on my experience and then other parts that didn't. I'll try to those. But Sarah and I were both part of the same writing program that was teaching the lower division students. And I was supposed to be in the union meeting, and I slipped out of it instead. I was a truant. And what happened after that allowed me to justify it, because I biked to campus, and I was on my bike, and I had stopped at the crest of the bike path hill, just above the chancellor's office, and I think they were having a party at that time.
At the chancellor's residence.
The chancellor's.
And that was before the music building was constructed.
Before the music
right?
building,
So
yeah.
there was a big open stretch of meadow up there.
So from there you could see the whole Bay Area, and I almost never do this, but I got off my bike there and just stood there because I wanted to really feel what it was like to be there. This was before the earthquake started, and at that point it started to rumble. So I probably saw more of the bay and more of the effects at a long distance than probably very many people there. And because of that, I wrote a little documentary here, a one-page thing that I want to share with you because it touches on so many of these same things. Santa Cruz, October 17, 1989. I'd bicycled to the crest of the hill where I often stopped before plunging into the rest of my life. It's where I used to cling to things in the landscape. A certain redwood trunk, shattered years ago by lightning, a white farmhouse that glowed at dusk, the separate ranges of Los Padres forest visible once a month across the bay, coastal fog piling up against the foothills, anything to stay awake to my life. It's hard not to come freshly to a place, even this one, full curve of the bay to the south, mountains to the east, year after year, and I was tired. Cattle grazed sleepily on the ridge beside me. None of this tonight. I stood there straddling my bike, staring over the tan hills rolling down to the bay when the shaking began. For some reason I knew. This is it, I said, matter-of-factly to no one. I wasn't afraid. Spread my legs for balance while the land started to shiver and ripple from under my feet all the way to the ocean. The forest to the east, redwood and bay laurel, thrashed. Its needles and leaves turned up their whiter undersides as if caught in a great wind, and dust rose from it, like an enormous beast shaking itself. A rumble deeper than thunder from everywhere, from nowhere, arose out of the earth and built it to a steady roar and grinding. The cows beside me drew into a quivering knot, stampeded up the ridge, wheeled and rushed back, desperate to get away from the locomotive bearing down on them from every side. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then the train veered away and passed. The cattle stopped and turned their blank white faces my way, rolling their eyes. Far across the meadow, people poured from a big house, a party, voices hushed, then rising in a crescendo. Beyond the first hill, a long cheer of relief went up from the playing fields. Then I noticed how deep the quiet was, that electric hum beneath the city suddenly gone. I dropped down the silent hill to town. Neighbors were outside by their fences, talking openly, tenderly, as I'd never seen them. Even in the silence of my street, they were clustered, chattering eagerly. My boys rushed up, telling me at once about everything broken inside, the refrigerator spilling itself onto the floor, how they tried to shut it, hugged the computer under the table, watched the windows bulge. Then C drove in, shaking and flushed. She'd been in her office, helped her patients out, picked her way down 3 flights of littered stairs, drove through brick and rubble, downed wires, dead street lights, safely home. Now she could sob. There were people under those buildings, I know it. There were. And that was the beginning. It still brings me to tears.
And that was written immediately after?
Probably within the year. I just found myself telling little parts of it to different people, and it seemed like it really needed to just be pulled together, because as I say, I started forgetting the things, and you were saying the same thing.
There's a detail that you have shared with me in conversation that I didn't see or hear in this reading just now, though maybe I just missed it, but you've talked about seeing a cloud of dust rising from downtown.
Mm-hmm. I did say that.
It was in there? Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
you were.
I just spaced. I guess. Yeah.
Wasn't it, Jennifer?
I think so.
It was there.
So, in that moment of being on the hill and being able to see quite a distance, what did you see? What did it look like to see the Earth move over such a large span of space?
Well, in addition to the animal image of it shaking the dust off of their coat, the most powerful and mysterious image was the actual land rippling. Mm-hmm. It was like it was liquid, and it started at the bay, because I couldn't see. I don't think it affected the bay itself so much, but when it hit land, it started to ripple the land, and the rippling came all the way across and up the hill to the university, and that's when I started to feel it. But I could see it coming, and I knew what it was exactly. So that's a view that I don't think very many people get to see.
Yeah.
For an earthquake.
Did you knew in that moment that it was an earthquake?
Oh yeah. And I knew it. I don't know what triggered it, but I think it was the jolt first that happens. At first, and you think this is completely unnormal. This can't happen any other way.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, did both of you understand the significance of the earthquake when it happened?
Pretty quickly. In part because of the intensity of the shaking where we were, and also, in my case, because Mike had that radio to his ear and was reporting to us what was going on at the ballpark in San Francisco. We already realized that the earthquake had quite a geographic reach, and if they were feeling it that powerfully up at the World Series in the city, that it must be a really big one.
Right.
Yeah. And it was, the duration, I think, was greater than that of any earthquake any of us had ever experienced before. Mm-hmm. And then pretty soon the stories started coming up from downtown of the unreinforced masonry buildings collapsing and the fears of people being trapped underneath. And then pretty shortly we got radio reports about the collapsed Cypress structure in the East Bay, on the freeway, and the liquefaction of the Marina district in San Francisco, and there were fires there, weren't there, in the Marina?
Yeah.
That's my recollection. So the news traveled pretty quickly by radio. Mm-hmm. It was pre-internet communication, right. So people were used to relying on radio and television, and my recollection is that's how we got the news from afar, mm-hmm. and fairly quickly afterwards. Yeah.
Did either of you have power outages?
Yeah.
Your power was out?
I'm pretty sure.
It was out everywhere, as far as I know.
I have no memory of how long that lasted, but I do remember not being able to go back into our building. Mm-hmm. Can't remember how long that lasted. I mean, these poor architects and engineers were making, frantic tours of the campus. Mm-hmm. I remember that they determined that the building called Natural Sciences 2 was really vulnerable in the aftermath, and they built some flying buttresses, if I remember right, to support the building so it would withstand further shaking. So they were very busy trying to figure out whether the building still had structural integrity, right. and whether residential buildings could be re-inhabited. And it's odd, I can't remember whether I was able to sleep in my apartment that very night. I suspect if I hadn't been, I would remember. Sure. Yeah. But I also remember that there was a crew of amazing employees in the dining hall at Crown who somehow, even while the power was down, managed to produce meals for all these students who were relying on them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the students who lived in apartments who normally would have been making their own meals were having to rely on campus dining services when they couldn't cook for themselves. They must have had some backup generation. I don't know what else they did. I think they were incredibly resourceful. And I don't think I gave a huge amount of thought at the time to what it must be like for these folks who had their own families to worry about and their own situations, who were somehow making it up to campus to serve everybody who needed help on campus. Yeah. But I think that must have been a heroic effort.
Yeah. Did the earthquake impact your life, and if so, how? In the hours, days, weeks, months, years following?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what it would be. The first thing is the shock of lost life. My ex-wife's medical office was just across the street from Bookshop Santa Cruz, which is one of the first things that went. So she was aware of that trauma there. And that's, when it happens in your own town, it's something that suddenly, it's not the things that happen somewhere else, it's something that happened right here. So yeah, I think that stayed with a lot of people for a long time.
What about your boys? You had two pretty young sons at the time, right?
Well, they were extraordinarily resourceful. They grabbed the two things that mattered the most to them, the refrigerators and the computer. And, you know, they must have stuffed all the things back in the refrigerator and tried to close it. And they kept the computer from falling over. It was one of those big tower ones, you know, those old clunky things. And by doing that, they probably saved a lot of lost data. Yeah. So.
How old were they at the time?
Well, I was trying to remember that. 10 and 7, I believe.
So old enough to have memory of it.
Oh yeah, we talked about it just recently, actually. So it's still very much imprinted on them.
Mm-hmm.
Do I remember right that you've described like jars and boxes and cans from the kitchen cupboards all just sort of in a mess on the floor?
Yeah.
And jars broken open and plates and glasses and things like that.
They were trying to clean it up when I got home. They were so afraid that maybe they'd get blamed for it. Did you do this while we were gone?
I remember that sense that comes over a community after a disaster. As we later experienced in a sort of different way after the September 11th events, when strangers are suddenly more open to each other and feel like comrades. There's a sense of, you know, shared emergency, and I think about the remarkable efforts at Bookshop Santa Cruz to save what they could of the inventory there. We weren't there, but we heard this time and time again from friends about the bucket brigade that formed, and I'm sure you've gotten much more direct accounts of this and read about it, but you know, just knowing that out of great love for that important community institution, which was and has remained a kind of living room of our town, that people just massed at Bookshop wanting to help protect that place, and they were given, I think, very little time by the safety authorities to get into the bookstore and get the books out, and they did that with great alacrity with lots of volunteer help, and then created this amazing institution called Book Tent Santa Cruz, which stood for years until the bookshop was able to move into its new digs. And every time I went into that place, it was a reminder of a kind of community spirit. And I remember the way that many people in the town came together to envision what was going to happen to what had been the Pacific Garden Mall, what Pacific Avenue was going to look like, and what we wanted it to be, and were we going to support local businesses, and how would we rebuild. And I wasn't a direct part of that experience either, but I was affected by the knowledge that it was happening. It felt like a galvanizing moment for our community to think about itself and what its vision for itself was. Right. I feel really fortunate that, you know, I wasn't directly affected in a negative way. I didn't, nobody near and dear to me was injured or killed in the quake. And I was 32 years old and, you know, a fairly young, footloose and fancy-free professional. I didn't have children depending on me. It was an adventure. I had students who I was responsible to, but really the moment didn't ask a great deal of me compared to, you know, what a lot of people taking care of elderly parents, people who were elderly and dependent. You know, I think it was a relatively luxurious position from which to experience a disaster.
Yeah. In doing these, I have heard a lot of stories about the community coming together, specifically around the Pacific Garden Mall, and again in the downtown Watsonville area, which were both very much adversely affected by this. I haven't spoken to many people who were part of the UCSC community. Do you feel like you have any specific insights or experiences around being part of that community specifically in regards to the community coming together for the greater good of itself?
That's a really good question. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I was going to turn it back to you because of your, what's the name of the title that you had?
As resident preceptor.
You know, that's the intersection. That's where the caretaking and the helping really, the nexus of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was impressed with the logistical commitment that the university made for safety and lighting and heating and food and so forth, all those things. But they didn't. I wasn't an integral part of them. I was one of the people who lived off campus, and what they were often saying was, "Please stay off campus because we have enough to do up here."
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, it's interesting how my sense of community coming together has more to do with the town, even though I was both employed by and in residence at the university. I mean, I was conscious of the employees working really hard to make sure that everybody had what they needed. And I was deeply impressed by my resident assistant in particular, and by the sort of resilience of the students. I don't have a strong sense of the campus coming together as a community, and that may reflect just my idiosyncratic personal relationship to the campus. But it's interesting just to realize that that doesn't stand out for me as a strong memory.
Now, you were both teaching at the time, correct?
Mm-hmm.
When classes resumed, eventually, did you notice any changes in your students?
I may have, but I don't have strong memories of it.
And that's where the reviews come back, right? The narrative.
Looking back at the narrative evaluations, right, none of them mentioned the earthquake, even though it took place during that quarter for which I read the evaluations. I mean, I'm sure there were students who were traumatized either by the experience of the quake itself or by fears or concerns or worries about family members who lived in areas that were more directly affected. I mean, there must have been students in my classes who were from San Francisco, for example, or from Watsonville, or who had, direct relationships to stuff going on in Santa Cruz. And I mean, maybe it's a poor reflection on my own sensibility at the time and or my memory that I don't pull up memories of specific students and their experiences, but I'm sure it had to have affected them. I mean, and we must have had conversations in class. The first time our class reconvened after the quake, we must have talked about it. And it's stunning to me that I have no memories of that. I don't know what that says, but there you are.
What about you?
I do remember turning over classes to a discussion of people's anxieties and success stories and so forth. So yeah, I do remember that. It was a lot of caretaking and trying to bring some sense of compassion and intimacy to so that there was some place to go. And I remember spending long hours in conferences, individual people who had all kinds of quirky responsibilities or questions or problems or things that had happened because of it that required attention. And I felt oftentimes like a kind of gatekeeper. You should go see so and so. You should see the provost here. You should see whatever it else. And there were minor things, but because I don't think there was any student fatalities or any campus fatalities that I'm aware of.
I think that's right.
So that would have really amplified it. But so people, as soon as they found out that was the case, there's a lot of relief. There's not people I have to be worried about or fearful for.
Well, I'm glad you have some specific memories of that.
Well,
at least one of us is carrying those memories.
There's another aspect of the psychic aspect that I want to just drop in here if I may.
Please do.
Sometime in the next, in the hour, sometime in the first year or so of this, I had a dream that involved the earthquake and the fact that it was the World Series was just about to begin. It was like 5 minutes away from starting. And in particular, a single image that's, I don't know where it got into my head, but of the bleachers, and I think it was, I can't remember which stadium they were playing in, but the bleachers up in the top layers had cracked open. So here's these crowds
in
there.
your dream image?
No, in real life.
For real?
Yes, they had pulled apart. You know, there would have been, if people had fallen down in them, they would have died. And that got woven into my dream too. The reason I'm being sort of self-serving about this is that I think the energy, the trauma energy, goes underground and comes up in strange ways.
Mm-hmm.
Like this dream, in some ways, it's a total farce. But I'm convinced that it helped me in certain ways to remember and recall and preserve that trauma and not let it drive me. So I don't know whether you like baseball, but it's a baseball image. And it's called After the Earthquake, Candlestick Dream. Forget the broken things, the Bay World Series. It's back. I must be leading off. I'm up to the batter's box, scuffing the chalk line, suddenly scared. How did all this happen? The pitcher looms and kicks. Afraid to move from my crouch, I see nothing. Smack, ball one. 3 more must follow. Now I'm on third, bases loaded. Jim Gurley at the plate. I've always admired Jim. Impeccable manners, discretion, wire-rimmed glasses. A true gentleman batting cleanup. The fans are standing, pounding their broken seats, chanting while the pitcher, I can't see him well, works from the stretch. I edge down the line and glance toward home. Somehow, Jim's dragged his piano, a baby grand, to the batter's box and breaks into a sonata. Chopin, I think. Exquisitely rendered. The cavernous stands fall silent. Glissandos float to the second deck where I see a crack, a jagged column of empty seats. The pitcher stops mid-stretch. I see him clearly, tears caught in his stubble. Jim's over the keys, bent in a crescendo that builds to a frenzy, and now I turn and sprint for home, slide under the piano ahead of the tag, and the fans go crazy, raining down their trash. I think it's the sonata. On my way past the bat rack, I stop to stroke my lucky one, and there it is, that deep rumble, another aftershock. Who cares? I'm a kid again. The fans are screaming. Baseball in October. Let it shake. So it's a totally different mood from the first thing. So it happened, there's some separation, but I just had this feeling my psyche was trying to put this thing together again. Mm-hmm. Here's this worldwide trauma that takes place in my backyard that I'm a participant in, and I made it out safely. My family was safe, my friends were safe, my colleagues were safe, but there were people who weren't. And all of that's sort of inside there. And this seems like the best place I've ever had of reading that poem because it's really focused on that kind of stuff. And you know, so but
And you truly did make it home safe.
yeah, the metaphor was very true.
Yeah.
And I was not sitting at home like figuring out how this thing would work out. It's just like I just wrote down what happened in the dream, which is very rare. I don't do dream poems very much, but it worked.
Clearly it was necessary.
It was for me,
To switch gears a little bit, do either of you take precautions against natural disasters given your experience?
You'd
Well,
think we'd do better.
It's interesting time to be thinking about that since we've just been through, at our house, 36 hours of public safety power shutdown in light of the heavy winds and the dry tinder and the unmaintained Pacific gas and electric equipment and the danger of wildfire. So we've been thinking about that, the danger of wildfire and what happens when the power goes out. We're it has taken, going through the Loma Prieta earthquake and various kinds of disasters and power outages to keep nudging us to get serious about preparation. We've done a little more than we used to. We have lanterns and batteries and candles, pretty well supplied with that sort of thing. We have a radio that's powered with a little solar panel and a little crank. And we know who out of town to call if there's a disaster here and the phone lines are down, so we can triangulate on information out of town. So we have some degree of preparation we didn't used to, but really it's amazing how resistant I have been to getting smart and on top of those kind of things. And really it's taken sort of repeated disasters and potential disasters. Last year's horrible fires all over California that could well have happened to us here in Santa Cruz County. So I don't know what that's about, but I think, each time another thing happens, we get cracked open a little more to feeling truly recognizing our vulnerability and our responsibility to be prepared.
Sure.
We still, however, have not put those little latches on our cabinet doors that would keep all the jars and glasses from jumping out in the next quake.
Baby-proof.
Yeah, exactly. We have baby-proof cabinets for when the babies came through the house, the grandkids, but earthquake proofing on the higher cabinets, not yet. Maybe this interview will prompt us to do that.
There's a hardware store around the corner. You touched on this briefly earlier. What is it like to reflect on your experience 30 years later?
It's. I feel it really acutely how attenuated memory is, how it shrinks, certainly with age and with just life experience. I think, I feel like there's a finite space there, and it gets filled up and pushes stuff out the back end when there's new stuff comes in the front end.
Yeah, that's part of it for me, and I felt sort of appalled to realize how attenuated and also probably distorted my memories are. And then I thought, well, it's almost half my lifetime ago. 30 years is a long time, and a lot has happened then. And in some other ways, it feels so vivid to think back on it. I think the sort of cumulative effect of being witness to other disasters around the world just through news broadcasting and being aware of what's happening in the world, and then more closer to home, the disasters and near disasters that have come our way. Over these 30 years, I've done some pondering about that and about the value in being sort of jolted out of our daily life, the ways in which we can open up to our neighbors and community members more. And I think every time that happens, I learn something about the potential for community connections, and about how those realizations in those moments of extremity can be applied to the way we live on a daily basis.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
Well, I'm glad that you're trying to bring in Watsonville as a community, because it impacted them, and probably they didn't get nearly the attention or resources that Santa Cruz did.
No, not at all. Well,
Otherwise, I think you
I guess.
covered the territory well.
great.
And the thing that stays with me is just this sense of the potential to discover our resilience as a community when a big disaster beyond our control befalls us that way. But that's one of the things that stays with me from the Loma Prieta earthquake and other moments when we suddenly realize how interdependent we are. So thank you so much for...
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for coming here and sharing your story with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jen.